Hi, I'm James Schillinglaw for Insider Travel Report, and I'm here once again with a familiar face, Bill McGee, who's the Senior Fellow, Airlines and Travel for, I got that right, American Economic Liberties Project, right?
Absolutely. You got it right.
And we talked
One
with
take,
Bill.
too.
Yeah, there you go. And we talked to Bill most recently about the recent court ruling that actually basically nixed the merger between JetBlue and Spirit. But we're back today because American Economic Liberties Project and a partner, he'll explain who that is, have just issued a report that has the ambitious title of How to Fix Flying, a new approach to regulating the airline industry. Now, we've all talked about how bad the airlines are for a variety of reasons and everything that's happened in the last. And Bill and I have been watching this space for about 30 years, I think. So we're going to talk to Bill about this new report, what he thinks the impact will be, what he wants the impact to be, and we're going to go over it sort of piece by piece, but also tease you to go and read this report. And you'll see a link here at the bottom that you'll be able to find more about it. It's a fascinating report, great report on this industry, and we'll talk about that and a whole lot more here on Insider Travel Report. Now, Bill, first of all, great to see you so soon. Quickly, you had teased me before saying this report's coming out, and we should really take a look at it, and we did. It came out last week, and here we are. I've had a chance to zip through it. It's a pretty long report, and it's a very weighty topic, obviously. So, what are kind of the major problems that your report identifies with the airline industry? You're talking about things, everything from smaller seats to what they call junk fees, delays, cancellations, safety, of course, limited competition, of course, and consolidation, and of course, less service. And you are sort of recommending that Congress has to take another look at regulation, which, in 1978, for those who remember, like us, we're old, the airlines were deregulated and they went off thinking that this would result in better service and lower fares. Of course, that did not happen. So we're going to talk about why regulation is the answer and what is the prospect, all the things that your report recommends will be instituted, given that there's such a strong airline lobby. So let's first of all talk about the areas that you're looking at in this report, okay? And I'll let you go through them. There are four areas that you're kind of focused on, and then you have recommendations in each. And first of all, what are the four areas?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on, James. I've been, as you said, teasing you about this for a while. We worked for more than a year on this project. This is a serious undertaking. We put a lot of work into it. I'll show you what it looks like.
There you go. It's actually in print. There you go.
How to Fix Flying. As you say, it is available. Anybody that wants to pull it up for free, they can do that. We encourage everyone to read it. And I want to point out that this is a joint project. I co-authored it with Ganesh Simran at Vanderbilt University at a project called the Vanderbilt Policy Accelerator. And together, we've been working on this for a long time, as I said. We launched it last week in Washington. And I have to be honest with you, I think in all of the 39 years I've been in and around this industry since I first started working in the airlines in 1985, I don't think I've ever been more pumped up about something. Mm-hmm. And the reception was quite good. We did some briefings last week we did some briefings, including up on the Hill. We had a really good turnout for staff from members in the House and the Senate, both Democrats and Republicans. Everybody knows there's something wrong with this industry. Everybody, it seems, but airline lobbyists and their friends. We made that point that we're sort of past the whack-a-mole stage. I have done, since I joined American Economic Liberties Project almost 2 years ago, I've done as much media appearances as I've ever done in my life. Mm. And there is this sense, I mean, we keep using this term whack-a-mole because it's like you get a call and now we're talking about Boeing and we're talking about FAA oversight and then we're talking about refunds and then we're talking about bailouts and then we're talking about canceled flights and Southwest melting down. And it's like what are we doing here? We're just taking these problems one at a time. We don't seem to be solving them in the big picture. And we really wanted to step back. That's why I'm so excited to be at American Economic Liberties Project, because they're a small organization, but they think very big. They tasked me with this when I first joined, said, step back and take a look. So as you said, the first thing we needed to do was identify different areas. And so we have broken the paper up into four distinct parts.
Mhm.
One has to do with competition, geographic access, and resilience. And that is where the R word comes in. And we want to be clear, we're not shying away from the R word, regulation. As you know, it was a taboo subject for much of the time that I've, been around the airline industry. It wasn't even something that was up for discussion. It was just, it was understood that deregulation was the way to go, and that's it. But I want to be very clear that the reason that we call this a new form of regulation is we are not suggesting that we turn the clock back to 1978 and go back to the Civil Aeronautics Board model of that sort of comprehensive regulation. We're looking at a much more targeted and we think effective form of regulation. So I can get into that, but just to finish up with the different sections, we also have a section on fair and transparent pricing. Obviously, always a key issue in this industry. You know it, I know it. I'm sure most of the people listening to us right now know that this is about as complex a pricing mechanism in airfares than there is in the free market for just about any product you can think of. We all know the complexity. We all know how quickly they change. And we all know the range that you could have 100 people sitting on an airplane and they easily paid 40 different fares or more.
Absolutely.
And then, of course, dovetailing with much of my work in the last decades, we have a whole section on protecting passengers, consumer advocacy, protections, and safety.
Mhm.
And of course, that's been a big part of my work over the years too, and both as a journalist and an author and as an advocate. And so we have some proposals there, including the rather bold proposal to say that uh, since every U.S. airline now outsources much of its heavy maintenance, that foreign maintenance outsourcing, all these U.S. airlines that go to El Salvador and Mexico and Singapore and China and Brazil, that work needs to come back to the U.S. It's a safety issue, it's a security issue, it's a jobs issue, it's a trade issue. That experiment has failed. The FAA cannot provide the oversight overseas.
And we just had a situation there with the MAX aircraft again, and whether that was the Boeing challenge, which it may be, or whether that was maintenance issues, we don't know.
Right. Well, and what the Boeing issue did with the Alaska Airlines flight that thankfully no one was seriously hurt or killed on, but what it did was highlight this issue in a different way. Rather than airline maintenance outsourcing, we're talking about the levels of outsourcing that the manufacturer, in this case Boeing, does. Right. So they had this company Spirit in was it Wichita, who in turn were outsourcing overseas for parts. The FAA can't keep up with this. When I was worked on my book, Attention All Passengers, I found one case where there were 5 degrees of separation from the airline to who was doing the work. The
Pretty
outsourced
amazing.
repair shop would send a part out to somewhere else, and someone would say, "Well, we don't do that, so we're going to send it to another party." It gets insane.
It makes you
Um,
feel real safe after that, right?
yeah, yeah. And so then just to finish up,
Yeah, the
the
fourth
fourth
one, yeah.
section is oversight and enforcement.
Right.
And there, one key thing that we're trying to do, in fact, this may be the thing that could be done the fastest at this point. Senator Markey has introduced an amendment that we assisted with for the FAA reauthorization, which, as we know, has been extended and extended, but eventually it's going to get through the Senate. It made it through the House. And this amendment um, basically would calls for state attorneys general to be empowered to have oversight over the airline industry, which we think would have tremendous positive effects.
Mm.
As you know, in 1978, when the Deregulation Act was passed, really at the 11th hour, very late in the game, the decision was made to impose something called federal preemption. Most people don't know what federal preemption is, but it's a very simple concept. It basically means that only the federal government has any authority over the airlines and has
Right, right.
for going on 46 years now. And so that means state legislatures, state courts, state AGs don't have authority. We're saying we need to empower state AGs. When we had the situation with the unpaid refunds during COVID, Senator Markey put it at about $10 billion in unpaid refunds. Uh, all of those states were getting complaints and they could have assisted. The DOT was swamped and couldn't even respond. So there's a lot here. I'll let you decide where you want to sort of focus in.
Yeah, well, let's go really through all four sections of the report, and you can give me your highlights of some of the recommendations you're making. You can give me a quick. We've already talked a little bit about some of the challenges, and so what we want to look at what you're recommending. And also, we'll talk a little bit about the prospects that some of this might be taken up by Congress. We're hoping, and some of it will be. I think, as you said, a re-regulation of the industry is not something we're going to see in total. That's just not going to happen. I wish it were a little more regulated, but given the how far we've gone in terms of the regulation is kind of one of those bad words that you're not supposed to say about government and things like that. But anyway, let's look in turn. First of all, let's look at that competition, geographic access and resilience section of the report. What are some of the recommendations that to solve the issue? Because obviously we have a lack of service. We're having a lack of competition in hubs that you're talking about, the famous fortress hubs,
Right.
that the majors have instituted, which has been, and then we're talking about resilience also in terms of when something happens.
Sure.
Whether that's a weather-related incident or something like that, the airlines admittedly haven't been very good at picking up the pieces at the end. But talk a little bit about what you're recommending in that section.
Right. And you're right, as far as, the use of the R words. We want to be really clear about what we're trying to do here. When we were in Washington last week and we had a kickoff at the National Press Club, and as I said, we did briefings on the Hill, et cetera, we were saying that what we want to do is launch a national conversation about this industry. It is a vital industry. The airline industry is critical, not just to all of us having the freedom to travel and commerce, but it's vital to our economy. It's vital to our security. We all agree on that. That's one thing that airline executives and we agree on. But it is also a broken industry. And I want to make one thing very clear. When we say that deregulation has failed, I know that sounds like a very subjective statement, and it sounds like, the other side would say, well, we'll argue with you on that. The fact is, I would urge everyone, it's very simple, go to Google and put in Airline Deregulation Act of 1978. You don't have to read the whole thing. It runs 300 or 400 pages. Read the preamble, which is one very long sentence, okay? And it states what the goals were in 1978.
Right.
I would challenge anyone to tell me that the promises that were made have not been broken. It basically says there will be more competition. No, we have less competition. More air carriers. We have fewer air carriers now than we did in 1978. We will not have, consolidation. Well, we have the most consolidated industry that we have ever had. And we would not have, an oligopoly, basically. And that is what we have. As you know, the big four, American, Delta, United, and Southwest, control 80% of the market. That's a level we've never had before. We have 12 scheduled passenger airlines in the U.S., including the two new ones, Avelo and Breeze. That's the fewest airlines we've ever had. And we just had a 14-year stretch from 2007 to 2021 without a single new entrant. Those are all broken promises. And I would defy anyone to say that that's a subjective statement. All you have to do is, as I say, read the act itself. So what we're saying is competition is key to all of this. And a big part of it is the airports. And as you know, there's a slot constraint program for takeoff and landing slots. It's very limited. There are only 7 airports in the program and only 3 that are really, 4 of them are just monitored, but 3 that are really, in a day in and day out controlled. And what we're saying is we need to look at airports because, what we did was we reached out not to Airlines for America, the trade organization for the big airlines, but to National Air Carrier Association, which represents the smaller ones, Spirit and Frontier and them. They know about this because they have trouble getting into airports, getting access. We're saying if we really truly want to fulfill what was said in 1978, then we need to provide access, we need to provide competition. We're also saying that this problem of what we're terming regional inequality has just gotten worse and worse over the last 40 years. There are sections of this country, they don't have hubs, they don't have ultra low cost carriers. They pay the highest fares. You travel all day to get anywhere. And then you have large cities, St. Louis, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, that have had hubs in the past and they close and
Right.
with it, corporations go away and the entire city economy or regional economy is affected. So we're saying a couple of things. We need to ban common ownership, which is basically a practice whereby the large institutional investors like Warren Buffett, they don't have money in American or Delta or United or Southwest. They have money in all four. And we're saying restrict that because that keeps out the new entrants. That
Right.
would go a long way to we're also trying to get legislation on this. It would go a long way to helping this. And then, Ganesh has come up with some interesting suggestions. One is called the draft pick suggestion to say, we know that the big guys don't want to serve smaller markets. They don't see the money there. We're saying they should be compelled to, and in a draft pick way. In other words, the big guys would say, okay, who's taking Dubuque and
Right.
who's taking, Butte, Montana, et cetera, until all areas are served. And that is one thing, the regulated era from 1938 to 78, it gets a bad rap. And I will freely admit that I might have contributed to it over the years because I hadn't done my homework. I spent a lot of time last year in the law library at Yale Law School, researching what was said at the time in the congressional transcripts, et cetera. And what we found is that pricing made sense for the most part because it was based
Mhm.
on cost. Imagine that, airline fares that were based on cost. Can you imagine that
It
concept?
blows your mind, huh?
Right? And the other thing was areas were served. You would not have had in the regulated era cities as large as St. Louis or Cincinnati not having enough service. So we're saying that this needs to be looked at holistically, like the post office, like most metro rail and subway systems. You don't price based on which stops or which time of day work best. You price for the entire system. And
Sure.
that's what we're saying. This is the big change, of course. We understand the airlines will be pushing back, but we're saying it's time these are big problems and they require big solutions. Are we saying we're the ones with all the answers? No, but we're saying let's start the conversation. There really was a national conversation in the mid 70s. I saw it. It was documented. I went back and I found in the record, cover stories in Newsweek and Time and hour-long documentaries on TV about the state of the airlines. There was a real discussion. Everybody who wanted to weigh in got a chance to weigh in or to testify. And we're saying that's what we need now instead of the whack-a-mole. We have hearings on very specific issues.
Right.
I've testified when Dr. Dow was dragged off a United Airlines flight a couple of years and beaten up. I was happy to do it, and I'm not saying it wasn't necessary. But we need to step back and say all of these are symptoms. The industry is broken.
Let's talk. Let's go to the second one, the fair and transparent pricing. And of course, since deregulation, there's been a lot in that area. And just in the last 10 years, the airlines introduced what they called ancillary fees, which essentially seem to be making them profitable at this point. They put in a lot of different pricing models. You have to pay a lot of extra things. I personally dislike it intensely, and I don't know anyone that really wants that kind of pricing mechanism, but they claim that's what the customer wants. I don't know what customers are talking to. It's not me, and it's not anybody I know. But let's talk about overall this fair and transparent pricing section of the report and what you're recommending.
Yes, I'm still waiting to meet that person. The airlines swear that people tell them,
There is a,
I love paying.
there's a customer out there who
Right.
they want this, and I'm like,
Please, more checked baggage fees, please, please. That's what we're asking for.
I know.
Okay, I still want to meet that person. It's a unicorn.
And I want to know, the person who doesn't really, who wants to pay for a seat, even though they've paid a fare for that seat. They want an extra thing.
Thank you.
I don't know who that is, but it's not me.
Thank you. So, as you know, I'm an FAA licensed dispatcher. I've forgotten more than I remember about that. But back when I worked in the airline industry, I was responsible for dispatching flights and weight and balance. And I can assure you, there is no difference on the fuel burn of an aircraft if a person is sitting in A, B, or C in row 14. Okay,
Right.
But the airlines will charge you more to sit at the window than in the middle seat, right? So again, show us who it is that wants to do that. We're saying, look, this has just gotten nonsensical. We have seen it just grow and grow and grow over 40 years. No one can make sense of it. Look, you've been a part of it. I've been a part of it in terms of helping consumers over the years. We've both written how many countless stories about here's how to get the best fares and Tuesday morning at 4 a.m. and all of that stuff. There's entire cottages of people that just help you get fares. And I don't degrade their work. I mean, it's a necessary service because who among us wants to pay more? But
Sure.
it's just that what other industry has that, right? I mean, are there people that make a living telling you how to get, how to pay less for a quart of milk or a new car or flat screen TV? I mean, I worked in Consumer Reports for 22 years. I mean, they would just shake their heads when I would say, look, there is no such thing as a good fare. They would say, what's a good price for a car? And they'd say, okay, this is it. Well, you can't do that with airlines, right? We're saying, look, let's go back to a more fair and sensible pricing system to have just a few fare classes, and there will be room for the low-cost carriers, for the spirits and whatnot. But two things that are important here. One is, if we're not going to get that, there has to be more transparency on fares and on fees. We all know this is a problem. And for many of you in your audience, for travel advisors, it is critical, right? And they are the ones that are caught in the middle, and they get beat up on both sides, right? The airlines, do not provide them with all the data on flights and fares and fees. And then on the other end, the customer, is upset, right? So there's that. But the other factor with pricing is it needs to be based on bare minimums. And what we mean by that is the industry needs to have, we're sort of edging into the safety section. I don't mean to bleed into another section, but
Okay.
we're saying they need to be minimum standards, for example, on seat sizes. That's a health issue, that's a value issue, but most of all, it's a safety issue during an emergency evacuation. So whatever the FAA and Congress determine, okay, this is a minimum seat size. Spirit or Frontier or anyone else cannot go below that.
Right.
We're also saying the same thing for maintenance, outsourcing, et cetera. So there is going to be a basement, which there is not now. It's just we're in a mad race to the bottom, and whoever can cut the most cost, whether it's on safety issues like pilot training and maintenance of aircraft and outsourcing, or how tight can we make the seats? So we're saying that. We're also talking about the loyalty programs and saying, look, if they're not going to be abolished, then again, there needs to be some common sense. The rules just keep changing, right? The goalposts move after you enter the game. So you enter, and in good faith, you're accruing mileage, and then suddenly it's time to redeem, and you're told, no, it's twice as much to,
Right.
to get
Right.
that upgrade or that trip. Okay. That's completely unfair. And, if you enter the program in good faith and you show, and they call them loyalty programs, right? You show loyalty to that airline, and for years you rack up your miles because you're looking to take that trip. And then now we're saying, no, retroactively, you can't change the rules for when someone entered. So there's a lot here, and we're just sort of skimming it, but, I encourage people to read and take a deep dive.
Well, that's the interesting part of this is that, when American Airlines instituted its first loyalty program, and it was, I guess, sort of a roaring success, and everybody else followed, and now every carrier has them, and it's difficult to redeem those miles, quite frankly.
Right.
And then, of course,
Right.
I mean, there's whole publications that have been formed looking at points.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, you
the
and I have
points
spoken
guy,
to them. They're
I mean,
experts. Yeah, sure, Randy.
that are helping you learn
Sure.
how to use your points. And honestly, I'm not an aficionado because I fly so many different airlines all over the world. You can't always get to some place on one carrier.
Right.
And so you got to
Right.
fly the different ones.
Right.
And then, of course, when you're lining up at the airport and they have a million different people going in front of you, because they belong to some status group. And I'm like, do I actually belong to that status group? Maybe
Or a code share partner, right? It's not even the airline that it has the metal, as we used to say, right? It's not even the
Right.
airline that's operating the flight, and that's why when you look at the flight information screen, it's wrote, the same flight has 5 different airlines registered, right? It's also Lufthansa. It's also, so all of that affects this. But, we're back to transparency again. We're saying that there needs to be more transparency about these loyalty programs as well.
Well, that's absolutely true. Loyalty programs and the pricing as well. And
Yeah.
I think for travel advisors, another thing that we have that they have is that here they are selling a ticket, and maybe they are getting some commission on that. They do not get commission, except in maybe certain special cases we're unaware of, on the ancillary fees.
Right.
And so,
Right.
they're trying to sell a service, and the airlines are saying, well, that's what the customer wants, but they're not getting any extra compensation for selling all those other things. So I
Well,
don't know anybody that wants these ancillary fees either. And there has to be some kind of, I wouldn't say regulation, but somebody's going to come out with a better idea. And, they can't just tell us, well, that's what you want. Well, no, that's not what I want.
right. Well, you say ancillary fees, I say junk fees, tomato, tomato, but we're talking about the same thing.
I'm,
And
I'm trying. I'm trying to be polite to the
I
airline.
understand, but President Biden used the term junk fees. So if it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me. Um, he was referring, of course, to an issue that we've been very vocal about over the years, which is the family seating fees, which is one of
Right,
the most
right, yeah.
egregious of all fees that a 4-year-old child should have to sit by themselves because they didn't pay extra to sit next to their
Well, maybe
kid.
the parent doesn't want him there.
Well, that's a whole nother story, and we'll do that on a different discussion. But let's stay with the junk fees for now.
Okay.
So yes, I mean, look, there's just transparency is a problem in so much of the industry, and so many of the problems we're talking about have to do with whether it's pricing, whether it's fees. Well, again, I mean, you're talking about travel advisors being in the middle, and they're not getting the information to help their own customers, right? But we also have, a whole section on safety and on protecting passengers. We're going to have to really just skim. But I
But yeah,
mentioned,
let's we'll move on to that. Although I did want to
yeah,
make one more
yeah,
ask one question about it. Part of this pricing and transparent pricing and fares is that concept of yield management that we hear so much about. And the airlines, it's almost like this kind of godlike policy that is why we all have different fares, is because they are trying to fill every seat on the plane. And at least from the flights that I've been on lately, they succeed.
oh, yes,
Every single flight these days is literally full. So,
right.
I mean, how do we get around that? Because these are allegedly some kind of system that they have put in that's going to price everything differently so they can fill every seat.
Sure. And so let's look at that. I mean, what we are saying, I know what the other side is going to say. They're going to howl saying, oh, we're raising prices, because that's what they say about everything. Anything you want to do. If you say, well, we shouldn't send airplanes to El Salvador where the FAA can't look at the work being done, they say, well, that's going to cost more money. Well, some things maybe need to cost more money. We're willing to have that conversation if it's about life and death safety issues. But in this case, what we're saying is a more sensible nationwide pricing system. Just as we put a stamp on an envelope and that letter can go across town or it can go to Anchorage, Alaska, right? Now, this is, I would say, let's be blunt about this. I think one of the issues we have to overcome is that many of the people that either set policy or discuss policy or write about policy in the airlines, they tend to be congregated in big places like New York and Washington, maybe
Right.
Los Angeles, Chicago, but we're talking big cities for the most part. And so therefore they have more choices. Not as many as we used to back when there were a lot more carriers and, in the regulated era and the post-deregulated era in the first decade or two. But they have more choices than much of the country. And one of the things we're saying about pricing is the range of what remember when we talk about pricing, we always talk about average fare. Well, that term average fare, the range has never been greater.
Right.
It was much more sensible in the regulated era where you knew, okay, this is the cost, and it was based on actual, what the airlines needed to fly that route, et cetera. Now, what we have is for every Spirit or Frontier or Allegiant fare where you're paying, $150 to go to Florida or something, on the other end, someone is being gouged. And there are parts of the country where you're regularly paying 3 or 4 times what the average is, right?
Right.
And that's what we're talking about addressing, making this truly a national issue. Much of America has been forgotten in all of this, except for in the big hubs in the 2 coasts.
Yeah.
And we're saying to make this more sensible. So we're trying to level that. And so while, you may not see $100 fare because that's not feasible when you're addressing the issues with seats and safety and pilot training and the rest of it. On the other hand, those that are paying 4 times more will start paying more for what is actually an average. We're really trying, we're not fooling around here. We're really saying we're trying to fix a national industry. And quite frankly, I think there are times where people forget it's a national industry. You
Right,
know,
right,
I was talking about fares. And by the way, with the fares, don't take our word for it. As you know, every quarter, the DOT puts out a quarterly airfare report. And look at it. I urge everyone to pull it up. It's a public document. It's very geeky. It's full of charts and small print. But, I look at it every 3 months. And you'll see that in this country, there are two industries. There's the industry where there's low fare carriers, and then people are paying less. And then if it's just American, Delta, and United, and sometimes Southwest, they're sort of sometimes low fare and sometimes not. They're weird out, sort of mix there. If it's just American, Delta, and United, then you are paying 3 times more what everybody else is paying. And
right.
that's the oligopoly part of this. And we're saying to break that up. We're saying reduce the size of the hubs. We're saying, downsize the hubs, reduce these, you use the term. That's the term that the industry uses, fortress hubs. Think about that a moment. A fortress. That's exactly what it is, an economic fortress. And guess what? You're paying more. So
Absolutely.
we're saying to look at that as well.
Well, let's
But
move on. Yeah, let's
yeah,
move on to the passenger safety. You did talk about that earlier about the outsourcing of maintenance, which is I still think is incredible that there's almost no maintenance done at airports anymore. It also probably means that why you can't get a replacement aircraft right away if an aircraft is bad because they don't have any, not anything because they're not doing the maintenance there.
well, so there are two types of maintenance. The heavy maintenance, as they say, where you send stuff out for scheduled work or for big things like engine changes, and then the line maintenance. And the heavy work is all outsourced, as you said. But also, I mean, you bring up another point. When I worked in the shuttle on the East Coast, New York, Boston, and Washington, and I was an operations manager, I actually had spare aircraft and spare crews to play with. Can you imagine? I mean, that is just, I speak to my friends that are still in the industry, and they laugh when I say that. I said, "You have spare aircraft still?" What, are you kidding me? They're lucky to get the schedule out the door with, with what they have now. As we know, in 2022, there is strong evidence, and we're still trying to find out all the details, that airlines are scheduling flights not knowing that they did not have either the aircraft or the crews, and they were taking money for them. So that is a deceptive practice. Some would call it fraud. So there are so many things that need to be addressed here. But on the safety side, in addition to the maintenance outsourcing, as you know, we have a crisis with air traffic control. We have a shortage.
Right.
We have, we've been talking, how long have we been talking about the next generation program?
At
For
least a
decades.
decade, maybe more.
Yeah, it's been more like 2 decades. We have the 1,500-hour rule where, some in Congress and some in the industry want to undo what was done after the Colgan Air accident, Continental Express up in Buffalo in
I know
2009.
that very well. I
And
lost a friend there, so it's
yes, I remember.
something to
Yes,
do.
yeah.
Yeah.
And, and then as you say, the seat sizes, yeah, they're a comfort issue. That's how most people think of it, or even a health issue for clotting and deep vein thrombosis. Most of all, they're a safety issue. And seat sizes go hand in hand with evacuation testing to make sure that aircraft can be evacuated. It got lost in the media coverage of what happened over Portland with Alaska Airlines, but this has been quite a year so far. January 2nd, you'll recall what happened in Tokyo with Japan Airlines, and that was a really large aircraft where that aircraft was in after a collision with a Japanese Coast Guard aircraft. That aircraft was in flames. Everyone got off. That was the good news.
Wow.
The bad news is um, it took the media reports I saw said it took somewhere between 14 and 18 minutes. That's not acceptable. We have to continue to work on this. And
Well, it's because the configuration of aircraft have not changed in many, many years in terms of seating. And I mean, if you've ever tried to get out of an aircraft and you're in the back, it's going to take you 15, 20 minutes. And
well,
yet when a safety situation occurs, you're going out the exit, in the exit
right.
rows and places like that. But it's not easy to get out of these things.
No, and so we're saying the FAA needs to do more here, and we need to ensure that it's not just computer modeling doing this, that there's more testing. So there's a lot. And then, of course, an issue that you and I have talked about in the past, the fact that for decades now, going back to the 80s, the FAA has not restricted lap children and allows
Right.
children to not be restrained. Every safety expert in the world says that there should be. Um, as far as passenger protections, we have a whole suite of issues in there. Many of them we've talked about before on sort of we've seen other countries like the EU and Canada, for example, put forth passenger protections that make sense, that are standardized, that are uniform, and most of all are mandatory. And not just for the airlines in their regions, but for everyone flying within it, right? So the way I put it is, here's the irony. If you're flying, say, American, Delta, or United, big three carriers that fly all over the world on behalf of the US and fly the American flag on the tail, the irony is if you're a US citizen flying on one of those airlines in Brussels or Paris, you actually have more protections than you did if you were in Dallas or Atlanta or Chicago, right, on a US airline, because it's mandated in other places. We're saying it's overdue for that. And to their credit, the DOT and Secretary Buttigieg have introduced a whole suite of proposals to strengthen that. So, of course, we're supporting that and some other efforts. But there's a lot here, as I said. I encourage everyone to read the paper.
Read the report. And then the final section, of course, is the section on oversight and enforcement. Talk a little bit about what you're recommending in that place. I know
Sure.
in part it's giving the state attorney generals also some oversight as well, if I recall. But
Right.
it's beyond that. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, yeah. The federal preemption issue that we talked about, there is legislation pending as we speak, and we're crossing our fingers on it, that state AGs will be empowered so that as American citizens, we have fewer rights, as I said, dealing with airlines than you do with virtually any other company. You can't just file a class action lawsuit in state court because of that federal preemption clause. And people are shocked to learn this. People that have been flying for 40 years don't know this. I encounter it all the time. I was at a travel show in New York with Peter Greenberg a few weeks ago, and I asked the audience, there were about 200 people there, and I asked the audience, "Can I see a show of hands? How many people know what federal preemption is?" Not one. Okay, I wasn't surprised. It wasn't I mean, I expected, but I thought maybe two or three, but no, none.
No.
So we are saying it's time for that. And here's the interesting part. About a year and a half ago, it was something like 37 or 39 state AGs, Democrats and Republicans. I want to stress this. This is bipartisan. They wrote to Congress saying, please give us the power to address this. Why? Because their offices are swamped, guess what, with complaints from airline passengers.
Absolutely.
So they can't do a thing. And they have to write a form letter saying, sorry, speak to the DOT. We can't do it. And then you speak to the DOT, and they are swamped as well. We have spoken to Secretary Buttigieg about this in the past, saying this is not, something that is designed to take power away from the DOT. It's to enhance it, that allows state AGs to assist. We're also saying, speaking of the DOT, we're suggesting that in the final days of the Trump administration, they passed constraints on the DOT's power itself under something called the Unfair and Deceptive Practices Rule.
So the AGs won't work, and the DOT really is kind of constrained.
And this was a self-inflicted wound. This was
Right.
like shooting yourself in the foot, right? And so we have urged Secretary Buttigieg to undo what the Trump administration did, and we're hopeful that that will happen. There's a lot here. As I said, our goal is to start a national conversation about these issues. There was a conversation in the 70s. Think about it. This vital industry, it's been half a century since we've really talked about it in a big way.
Mm-hmm.
We're saying, okay, if you have better ideas than we do, let's have them. We're not territorial about this. We want to start the thing. And, Ganesh, my co-author, he raised a great point last week when we were in Washington. He said, in every other space, think about areas where there are problems, other industries, healthcare, for example, financial firm. There is no shortage of pundits and white papers and people out there saying, okay, here's our proposal. There's dozens and hundreds in some cases. And yet, look at this. Isn't it interesting? This vital industry, everybody interacts with it. Everybody knows there are problems and it's broken. And yet, where are the practical suggestions other than the airline saying everything's fine, nothing to see here, just, laissez-faire. So we've entered this space, and we think in a big way to start this dialogue, start the conversation. But as I said, we're not territorial. We welcome everyone. We want to talk to travel advisors. We want to talk to airline labor. And we have shared this with them. And I was happy to see that we're already getting responses from people in these areas. We want to talk to airports. We want to talk to the small airlines and the big airlines. We want to talk to everyone in this ecosystem and say, of course, the FAA, the DOT, Congress. And we want to say, look, these are big problems, national problems. And, some of the recommendations can be addressed by DOT, some by FAA, many by Congress. But let's start it. Let's start the conversation. When something happens like what happened over Portland with Alaska Airlines, suddenly there's a laser focus on the airline industry.
Yeah.
And then we're back to, well, what happened? What's wrong? How did this happen?
Until the next one, right? Yeah.
Right. And you know as well as I do that it fades, because, next we're talking about the Super Bowl or Taylor Swift or what have you. But then suddenly something else happens and it's like, here we are again, right? Back to the whack-a-mole syndrome. We're saying enough. It's time to, have a national discussion.
Well, absolutely. And your report, to my knowledge, is the first comprehensive look at with definitive recommendations on what we can do to fix the airline industry that everybody that I know complains about. I mean, the
Right.
airlines will say, "Well, we get you most of 90%. We get you there. You're safe."
Right.
The safety record is pretty good overall, except for a few things like what we've had in the past month or so. But yours is really the first report, and I guess my final question really has to do with that. Is you've published the report. What's the next step in terms of what are you as the American Economic Liberties Project going to be doing to make sure that Congress, to make sure that regulatory authorities, to make sure that the airlines and the unions and everyone else pays attention and maybe starts to get the dialogue going, that at least we can look at some of these issues and get some of these things fixed?
Right. Well, you nailed it. I mean, it's a new year, and 2024, we hope to be a year where this is what we are talking about, that we are out there. I want to thank you because, you and others are helping us have a real discussion, not a soundbite for 10 seconds, but, a real discussion where we just took a deep dive on this. We're looking to write op-eds. We're looking to make appearances. We're looking to have panel discussions. And we're sincere in reaching out to the rest of the industry. I personally sent this to members in the travel advisory community and in airline labor. We want to start working together because we all face the same industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what can my readers, travel advisors, and viewers? We go out to about 126,000 of them. What can they do for their part to at least, first of all, obviously, was to go and read the report because it's long, but not that long. Certainly not as long as the original Deregulation Act. That's for sure.
No, it's not 300.
Although you've just clued us in that we can get the whole thing in the first paragraph or the first sentence. So, but anyway, what would you suggest that they do?
Yes, I would start with reading the paper. It's not that long. It's there's a lot in it, but it's 30 pages or so. Because source material is always the best. You'd be shocked how many times in this country we have arguments about things and people haven't read the source material, right? It's like I said, we're talking about the Airline Deregulation Act. Okay, you don't have to read 300 pages. Read the opening paragraph and you know that it has failed. It has not worked. We don't have what was promised, right? That's fact. I don't see how anybody can argue that. So what we're saying here is, yes, travel advisors have a stake in all of this. In going back and looking at the research, in the regulated era from 38 to 78, in those 40 years, I looked up how many mergers and acquisitions there were. There were a total of 11 in the airline industry. Mm-hmm. Since 1979, since deregulation, in those 45 years, there have been 45. We're averaging one a year, okay? Bankruptcies, according to Airlines for America, the largest lobbying group, pre-1978, they were extremely rare. It wasn't really a thing because it was kind of hard to lose money in those years. Some managed to do it, but because your profits were guaranteed under the regulatory system.
Right.
Since 1979, well, 212 by last count. Okay.
Oh my God.
Yeah. You and I have covered quite a few of them in our days working together, at trade magazines, writing about them, but 212 in the last 45 years. Okay. This is an unstable industry. That is something that every travel advisor in the country knows. And that, when you're dealing with this instability, with worrying about bankruptcies, worrying about mergers and acquisitions, it affects their work as well. And, we've talked so much about transparency. They're always caught in the middle, travel advisors. They're the ticket sellers. The DOT has rules in place enforcing, that they provide certain information to consumers, and yet they're not given that information in many cases on the back end from the airlines.
Right.
And, they're cut off from that. So everything that we're saying, in my view, is only going to help travel advisors. The transparency of all of this stuff. There's so much in this industry that is opaque, the fares, the fees, the flight data in some cases. the frequent flyer programs are a big mystery with a big question mark over them.
Right.
So we think all of this is going to help travel advisors. We want to work with them lockstep, just as we want to work with airline labor as well.
Well, and I mentioned that we're going to have a way to get to find this report, but just tell me exactly where can they get this report now?
Sure, absolutely. It is available online. It can be downloaded, and it is. I think you'll provide the link, but for those that are listening to this, economicliberties.us. That's our website. If you go there, you will see that it is available for download.
Fantastic. Well, Bill, always great to catch up with you, and congratulations, first of all, on this report. I know it's something, you've been intimately involved with the airlines for as I have, but you even worked for them back over 30 years ago. I think you've almost 40 years.
39 years, yeah.
That is amazing, and so you know what you're talking about. That's for sure. And now you've created this incredible report that really is, I think, the basis that might just make us solve some of these issues. I hope it's true. I mean, obviously, we know there's a strong airline lobby. I mean, if they were smart, I would get the airline lobby looking at it and saying, okay, yeah, we can probably do this stuff, at least some of it.
Right. No, I agree. That's exactly what we're hoping for, is to start that dialogue. For the other side to say everything's fine here, there's nothing to see. The argument is going to pass them by then. Basically, the discussion is happening either way. Do you want to get on board? Do you want to have input? I think back, James, to when you'll remember under Secretary LaHood, under the Obama administration, when we got the tarmac delay rules. And I worked with a dear friend of mine who just passed recently, Kevin Mitchell from the Business Travel Coalition. I worked with him and others. Kevin really put it together. A town hall meeting in Washington, basically. Senator Boxer was there, and Robert Crandall, retired from American, was there. And he had a discussion so we could talk about the tarmac delay rules. And I was very eager to jump in, particularly since I used to work in flight operations and I had firsthand experience with it. And guess what? Invitations were sent to every airline in the United States and Airlines for America. And, it's one of those debates where there's an empty chair.
Yeah.
They not only didn't come, they didn't respond. So that was a turning point for me. That was a huge turning point, because up until then I had good faith, and maybe I was a little naive. Okay, we may not be in agreement on things, but we'll get to the table and we'll sit down and, let's try and work things out. When the airline industry basically, thumbed its nose, or you can use another analogy, telling us, well, we're not going to take part in this discussion, then I said, well, then you know what? Then anything that happens, you don't get to say, well, you're upset about a new rule, right? As they did, because you won't even take part in the discussion. And it's the same thing here. We're offering, an opportunity to have a discussion. The discussion is going to happen. It's going to happen because I think the zeitgeist has changed. And I would say to you, I don't mind saying this, 10 years ago, I don't know that we could have launched an effort like this. The time wasn't right. Now it is, because now people are coming to us and saying, what are you doing? What's the big picture? So here's our response. This is our response to that. And so the conversation has already been kicked off. Are you going to join us? Are you going to offer practical solutions? Or are you just going to say, everything's fine, deregulation has been a raving success and nothing else needs to be done? Well, then you're not going to be a part of the solutions if that's the position. So we urge everyone that's, part of the, including passengers, join in. And hopefully I'll be back on to talk to you soon, and we'll have, more updates. Well,
we look forward to that time. Bill McGee, co-author of the new report from the American Economic Liberties Project, How to Fix Flying, a New Approach to Regulating the Airline Industry. You can find the link to read that report here. Bill, again, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about this. It's critical issues, and you and I have been covering the airlines for quite some time. You are really intensively been covering it. And thank you. I do hope this results in a national discussion that can help solve some of these issues, critical issues to what is a national industry.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And it's always a pleasure to talk to you. And I do want to thank my colleagues at Economic Liberties, because it was like all hands on deck, getting this done. And of course, at Vanderbilt, Ganesh and his team, who have just been great. So we're looking at, getting out there and talking more about this.
Again, thanks, Bill. I'm James Shillinglaw, and this is Insider Travel Report.